Qianak. Mr. President, President of the Finnish Sami Parliament, Ambassador, ladies and gentlemen, Indigenous sisters and brothers. First of all, I'd like to thank the CAFF for organizing this conference and the invitation to provide this keynote presentation. When I was invited, I indicated that I would like to briefly address the background of the Convention on Biological Diversity, the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals in the Arctic, and also, more significantly, the importance of human rights, Indigenous human rights, and specifically Inuit human rights. Before I begin, I want to reach back in time and share two quotes related to important international developments that have everything to do with Inuit as Indigenous peoples, biodiversity, and their interrelated nature. The first is from the late Eben Hobson, recognized as the founder of the Inuit Circumpolar Council. On June 13, 1977, in Utqiagvik, Alaska, Hobson welcomed Inuit delegates to the organizing meeting of the ICC, and he stated, "Our language contains the memory of 4,000 years of human survival through the conservation and good managing of our Arctic wealth. Our language contains the intricate knowledge of the ice that we have seen no others demonstrate. Without our central involvement, there can be no safe and responsible Arctic resource development." This quote is not merely a few sentences in English. These are powerful words, and it's a powerful message. Hobson was speaking volumes about Inuit status, knowledge, intellectual property, land and territory, sustainable development, and above all, our need to play a central role in Arctic policy. The term "our" speaks to the distinct culture of the Inuit, the Inuit language, a universe in and of itself. Over time, it's developed, and it reflects not only human relations, but more important, our relationship to our terrestrial and marine environment. Intricate knowledge, a highly developed, highly sophisticated, and detailed understanding of Arctic conditions based upon a profound and intimate relationship with the environment, observations, an understanding of other living creatures and their relationship to the environment. Hobson's specific reference to sea ice reflects an understanding of the cold, foreboding, harsh conditions that many non-Inuit are still working to understand in the face of dramatic and adverse changes. Hobson's ultimate observation, a reality since first contact, reflects comprehension and perspectives that we've seen no others demonstrate. I also want to conjure up, maybe it's on. Is it automatically advancing? Oh, it must be my feelings. Let's see if it holds here. I also want to conjure up the quote by Charles Ituk Edwardson. At the same time, at the organizing meeting of the ICC in June of 1977, Ituk, who was urging support for a resolution defending the right of Inuit to maintain their cultural integrity and explicitly their relationship with the whale, he stated, "The people who have called themselves conservationists," what is going on? "The people who have called themselves conservationists have chosen not to conserve the Eskimos. We are further compelled to tell the world who we are. The total depth of our environment and our association with the whale is dependent upon the survival of both communities, the whale as a species and Inuit as a species. Therefore, when we speak of biodiversity, it's imperative to keep the distinct status, rights, and world perspectives of Inuit as Arctic Indigenous peoples at the forefront of all considerations. The total depth of our environment, as Ituk exclaimed, is what we are addressing in the context of Arctic biodiversity. Later, in 1992, as has been discussed already, during the World Conference on Environment and Development, or commonly referred to as the Earth Summit, the Inuit in attendance did all that they could to leave their mark and to ensure that the world community knew of our existence. The resulting documents of the Earth Summit include Agenda 21, the Rio Declaration on Environment and Development, the Statement of Forest Principles, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, and the United Nations Convention on Biological Diversity. The antecedents of these instruments remain a central focus of the world community today. However, in this regard, I want to assure you that Article 8J of the CBD did not necessarily emerge from the goodwill of UN member states, but rather it's based upon the insistence of Indigenous peoples from the Arctic and elsewhere that we have a place on Earth and that our relationship with the environment is significant. One important footnote includes the fact that Maurice Strong of Canada was the Conference Secretary General, and the ICC was then led by Mary Simon, an Inuk as well as Canada's former ambassador for circumpolar affairs. An important pivotal backdrop was the ongoing heated negotiation and drafting of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Human rights violations, both past and present, have compelled Indigenous peoples to seek effective remedies and justice outside the states in which they live. Yet it was only in 1982 that the UN created the Working Group on Indigenous Populations to devise standards relating to Indigenous peoples' rights. Within a few years, the Working Group began preparing a draft declaration on the rights of Indigenous peoples. This led to a period of over 20 years involving different UN bodies before the UN Declaration was finally approved by the UN General Assembly on September 13, 2007. The vote in the UN General Assembly was 144 in favor, 4 against, and 11 abstentions. The 4 opposing states, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the United States, have all since reversed their positions. Canada declared in its November 2010 endorsement, "We are now confident that Canada can interpret the principles expressed in the Declaration in a manner that is consistent with our Constitution and legal framework." On December 16, 2010, the last objecting state, the United States, reversed its position. Thus, the UN Declaration is now a consensus international human rights instrument. The UN Declaration is the longest discussed and negotiated human rights instrument in UN history. It is also the first time that the subjects of the instruments, in this case Indigenous peoples, participated extensively along with states in its formulation. This process set an important benchmark for Indigenous peoples and their democratic participation in UN standard setting. The UN Declaration continues to grow in its significance. Regional and domestic courts and commissions are increasingly relying on the Declaration. Also, a system-wide action plan has recently been devised within the UN with international and national dimensions. The action plan has the goal of implementing, with the effective participation of Indigenous peoples, the Declaration at all levels. Again, there's an important intersection between the UN Declaration and the Convention on Biological Diversity. As many are aware, setting aside the subjective language of Article 8J of the CBD, it provides that each contracting party shall respect, preserve, maintain knowledge, innovations, and practices of Indigenous and local communities, embodying traditional lifestyles relevant for the conservation and sustainable use of biological diversity, and promote their wider application with the approval and involvement of the holders of such knowledge, innovations, and practices. This is groundbreaking language. The critical importance of Indigenous knowledge, the intricate knowledge that Hobson spoke of in 1977, is understood in such a way that it creates a solemn commitment on the part of states. States shall respect, preserve, and maintain knowledge, innovations, and practices of Indigenous peoples and promote their wider application with the approval and involvement of the holders of such knowledge. This language is unequivocal. However, I want to point out that the phrase Indigenous and local communities was chosen because of the political and legal milieu of 1992. Again, that specific milieu was the ongoing debate of the right of self-determination as understood in international law and its affirmation and its equal application to Indigenous peoples within the UN Declaration. More important is the fact that this debate was settled 15 years after adoption of the CBD in 2007, when the UN Declaration was adopted by the General Assembly, wherein the use of the term peoples in relation to the Indigenous right to self-determination was resolved and explicitly affirmed in Article 3 of the UN Declaration. Therefore, I would submit that the language of Article 8J of the CBD must now be read in the overarching context of recognition of the status of Indigenous peoples as peoples with the collective right to self-determination, and should not in any way be limited by the insistence of states to refer to Indigenous and local communities. We argue now, as we argued then, that we are peoples with the inherent right to self-determination. Therefore, all dialogue, documents, and any related actions concerning Indigenous peoples in the Arctic or elsewhere should be consistent with the international legal usage. The term local communities, in my view, must be dispensed with in all matters concerning Indigenous peoples specifically. And the commitments and obligations of governments, both Arctic and non-Arctic, must be adhered to on the basis of recognition of and respect for the rights of Indigenous peoples. The efforts of the CBD and its signatories to alter or diminish the solemn understanding of the term Indigenous peoples, in my view, reflects self-serving objectives that are wholly inconsistent with state obligations and their commitments to the minimum standards for the survival, dignity, and well-being of the world's Indigenous peoples, including Inuit, Sami, and other Indigenous peoples of the Arctic. Turning to the importance of 2030 Agenda and Sustainable Development Goals, I want to stress that they can ultimately be achieved through government adherence to and respect for the rights affirmed in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. In its most elementary expression, the term sustainable means something able to be maintained at a certain rate or level, or in the context of the environment, conserving an ecological balance by avoiding depletion of natural resources. Indigenous peoples have understood and lived by the concept of sustainable development long before the term was coined by the World Commission on Environment and Development in 1987, and its first usage in international law in the Rio Declaration on Environment and Development. Indigenous knowledge has sustained our communities for centuries. Many of the standards, guidelines, protocols, and values, ranging from so-called management of our resources to seasonal interactions, to our spirituality, and beyond, pivot upon concepts of sustainable development, and they are embedded in our language. Like human rights, the elements of sustainable development are interrelated, interdependent, and indivisible. From Inuit out there and on the land and on the ocean. And that's manifested through our profound relationship with our environment. As Ituk stated in 1977, we are a species like the whale is a species. So to achieve Inuit cultural integrity and our overall security as distinct peoples with the right to be different and to be respected as such, the actual indicators of our well-being were established with the 2007 adoption of the UN Declaration. The norms affirmed in the UN Declaration were influenced by and informed by the first-hand expressions and stories of Indigenous peoples at the international level, including Inuit from throughout the circumpolar region. In addition to the UN Declaration, other Indigenous-specific human rights standards are articulated in ILO Convention number 169, as well as the OAS American Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, adopted in 2016. If we are to achieve the objectives of Agenda 2030, it must be understood that Inuit lifeways are inextricably linked with what are now referred to as the Sustainable Development Goals. Indeed, it's largely due to lack of respect for and recognition of Indigenous human rights that our cultural integrity is threatened by the values of the non-Indigenous world. Indeed, the future we want, and specifically paragraph 49, states that we stress the importance of the participation of Indigenous peoples in the achievement of sustainable development. We also recognize the importance of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples in the context of global, regional, national, and subnational implementation of sustainable development strategies. So in conclusion, for Inuit, distinct peoples that inhabit approximately 40% of the Arctic circumpolar region, our involvement and our knowledge of Arctic flora and fauna is essential. In my view, respect for and recognition of Indigenous human rights lies at the core of sustainable development and the maintenance of biodiversity within our Arctic homeland. Indeed, the outcome document from the 2012 Rio Conference, entitled The Future We Want, states clearly the importance of participation of Indigenous peoples in efforts to achieve sustainability. More important, collectively, we must all work to ensure that the individual Inuk in Powlatuck or Upannavik or Johaven or Kaktovik or in Ulan can live and maintain their way of life every day for decades to come. Kuyanak, thank you.